late 80s. What happened in 70 AD? The fall of Jerusalem, okay? The destruction of Jerusalem, the fall of Jerusalem. In other words, these people had seen the Jewish nation conquered and basically destroyed. They had seen all of that scattered. By this time in the Roman Empire, there's a very clear understanding beginning to surface that Christianity was not just another sect of Jewishness, that it was something entirely different, that these people were worshiping this Christ guy, whoever he was, and that he was a historical figure in Judaism, but to the rest of the Roman world, he was a nobody. But the reality of the gospel had begun to penetrate the Roman Empire to the point at this time that Christians were really beginning to face intense persecution. When we get to the book of Revelation, that's going to be very apparent. You know, the very fact that John's in exile is proof that the Roman Empire has begun to seek out the top leaders of Christianity and do away with them. Okay? By this time, Paul's gone, Peter's gone, you know, the apostles are gone. John's the only one left. And the church at that time in the Roman Empire is facing intense persecution, and for some reason it seems to be centered very strongly in these churches in Asia Minor. And so John is writing this gospel to encourage these believers that they can believe that this Jesus indeed is the Son of God. And then, of course, in his letters, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, especially in 1st John, he spends a lot of time hammering home to them the reality of what it really means to be a believer. And then, of course, when we get to Revelation, it's all about encouraging them to understand that this Christ is indeed victorious, and that they can have faith and they can persevere even in the face of the worst of persecution, knowing that God is victorious, and that they don't have to be concerned about whether this thing is just going to fade out and disappear. So you see then that all the way through, John is interested in the proof and the reality that Jesus indeed is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now, as I said, as to the writing of the book, there's very little dispute except in liberal circles. And of course, liberal circles are going to try to make everything unbelievable. Most liberal theologians would tell you that this book and some of the other books were not written until the 2nd or 3rd century. Of course, by the way, I don't know if you all have heard, but it's been fairly recent, within the last couple of years, they've discovered some documents that were unearthed and found that had fragments of the Gospel of John written into them, and they've proven, because they know when these documents came out of the time period of about 115, 120 AD, and they contain writings from the Gospel of John, which proves the Gospel of John had to have been in circulation quite a while before these things were written, and they were written in 115, 120, which literally blew out of the water many of the liberal ideas concerning a pseudonymous writer of the book of John in the 2nd or 3rd century. So, give them enough time, they'll hang themselves every time, okay? So, historically, it's pretty evident that John, when he wrote these books, there's very little argument about where he was, what was going on. Polycarp testifies, and by the way, Polycarp was a 2nd generation student of John. Polycarp testifies to the fact of these books being written by John while he was at Ephesus. Eusebius' his Ecclesiastical Histories records this, as well as does Clement of Alexandria, and some of his writings talk about the Gospel of John and how all these things were written. So it's pretty evident then that John is writing these things, encouraging the church at Ephesus and the other churches in Asia Minor about the situation concerning Christ, and encouraging them that they can have faith and believe that indeed Jesus Christ, the historical figure, was indeed the Son of God and is indeed the Son of God. So it's interesting if we go back and look at this passage that I just raised. When you look at the grammar, really a better way to read this passage is literally to read it to say these were written. In other words, I wrote this down, I wrote these things down so that you may go on believing that Jesus is the Christ. In other words, that your faith is not shaken by the things that are beginning to come to pass and the persecution that you are beginning to fall under. You can go on believing. You have been believing. You can continue believing. After I record these events and the life of Christ, you can continue to believe that Jesus indeed is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now, with that understanding, a good way then for us to think about the writings of John would be for us to think of it in this three-tier fashion. First, that the Gospel of John is a way in which he gives an orderly account of the earthly life of Christ, and therefore prove him to be the Christ, the Son of the living God. As we move to the letters of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, the letters are written to encourage the Christians concerning the truths that he already expounded in the gospel, and to exhort them to love the brethren, and to warn them of possible desertion from the gospel. If you go back and read 1st and 2nd and 3rd John, it's very evident that's one of the things he's doing all the way through that letter. Stand firm. These are the things. If you're really a child of God, this is what should be showing up in your life. If you're not, you need to realize you're lost. John's favorite expression in 1 John is you're a liar. Not exactly something that probably won friend and influenced people. But John was very blunt. And what that tells us is the times were serious. There was no mincing of words at this point. People were dying because of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And John said, if you're not living like this, then you're lying to yourself. You need to wake up. This is what a child of God is. It was cutting to the chase. And then, of course, the same thing in Revelation. John doesn't mince words. Even in the pictures that he forms, it's very real. And then as you move to the Apocalypse of John, it's written to the churches, proclaiming the victory of Christ as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, so that the churches of Asia Minor will remain true to Christ in the midst of the present and the coming persecution of the church. By the way, it's pretty evident as you read through the book of Revelation, not only was the church at that point under persecution, but there was a very clear understanding that the persecution was not going to get better, but that it was going to get much, much worse. And so John is writing this to a people and saying, it's bad now. Here's the good news. It's going to get a whole lot worse. A lot of you are going to die for the faith. But you remember this one thing. Christ is victorious because he is indeed King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And whether it happens soon or later, Christ is going to bring all this to its proper end. In a lot of ways, John is telling these Christians, this is worth dying for. We don't think of things in that term, do we? But he's writing that and saying, the gospel is worth dying for.